In a movie theater in a Detroit shopping mall, Paul reads his science fiction book while the viewers watch the film being played on the projector. During the reading, the man reads a story about a dark and mysterious substance that was found hundreds of years ago and seems to be able to do unimaginable things. Sometime later, Paul goes to the projector room, but while he is handling the equipment, the power goes out, leaving the entire theater in total darkness. Paul quickly looks in the direction of his window, and after noticing that all the customers have disappeared from one second to the next, he sets off to look for his coworkers. While walking through the corridors, the employee hears some screams, at which point the mall's power comes back on. Looking around, Paul finds hundreds of pieces of clothing lying on the floor, as if all human beings had suddenly been erased from reality. Soon after, the man is found by one of the security guards, who asks if his colleague has managed to find any other employees. Paul replies that the theater is completely empty, and says that he has no idea what's going on there. So the men decide to walk together towards the security center, and halfway there, the security guard hears noises coming from one of the clothing stores. Believing that someone might be lost in the area, the guard asks Paul to wait outside and walks off into the darkness. At this point, the flashlights begin to fail, and the man taps his equipment a few times, making it work again. However, as soon as he looks in the direction of the store, Paul comes across the security guard's clothes lying on the floor. Before he could leave, the man heard noises coming from the shadows, and suddenly one of the silhouettes started running towards him. Far away, Rosemary, a physiotherapist who wasn't wiped out during the blackout, runs through the hospital corridors, screaming as she tries to find any survivors. After a few minutes of searching, the woman comes across a brightly lit operating room, and on entering she finds a patient who was abandoned on a stretcher during the operation. At the same time, the lights in the hospital began to flicker once again, and before the survivor could rescue the poor patient, the power disappeared. Scared, Rosemary drops her flashlight on the floor, and after retrieving the object, she realizes that the patient is no longer there, making her even more frightened. On the other side of town, a journalist named Luke wakes up in his girlfriend Paige's apartment and is confused to realize that his wife is not by his side. Despite this, the young man carries on with his routine as normal and goes to the bathroom, where he brushes his teeth calmly. Before he could even be grasped by the hands of darkness, Luke walked out of the room and towards the living room, making him realize that all the power in the apartment had stopped working. Thanks to this, the young man's cell phone runs out of battery, and after noticing that his girlfriend has left a note saying she's gone to work, he decides to find out what's going on in his building. So Luke goes to the lobby and walks around the place completely distracted, causing him to miss the victim's clothes, which are scattered all over the floor. Soon after, the young man decides to go outside while he looks at the newspaper, and is confused when he realizes that it is the newspaper from the day before. At that moment, Luke steps on a pair of glasses, and when he looks around, he sees a lot of clothes and vehicles lying on the streets, as if all the inhabitants had evaporated. While trying to understand what happened to everyone in Detroit, the young man is surprised by a large plane, which ends up crashing a few blocks away, causing a huge explosion. Believing that his girlfriend may be in danger, Luke rushes to the building where Paige works and starts looking for her, without even realizing that he is being chased by shadows. During the investigation, the young man arrives at his girlfriend's desk, where he finds a telephone, but the device has run out of battery and he gives up trying to turn it on. Soon afterwards, Luke comes across Paige's picture frame, and after concluding that the woman may have been deleted just like all the others, he feels devastated. At that moment, the young man notices a silhouette moving in one of the doors, and decides to go to the place to understand what it is, making him forget about the object, which ends up being consumed by the shadows. 3 days later, Luke is walking alone through the streets of Detroit at night, trying to find a vehicle so that he can get around the city more safely. However, the survivor can't find it, and during his investigations, he decides to lock himself in one of the cars so that he can hydrate a little. Suddenly, the young man is surprised by a man who begs him to open the door immediately. Realizing that Luke isn't responding, the man explains that he needs a source of light, as his lighter is out of fuel and the shadows are coming to eliminate him. Despite this, the young man decides not to help him, and realizing that he will have nowhere to hide, the guy tries to run desperately on his bicycle. The problem is that the shadows are extremely fast, and before he can even react, the man is captured by the silhouettes, leaving only his clothes behind. Now that the situation is safer, Luke gets out of the vehicle and continues his exploration. A few minutes later, the young man walks through the streets of the area in search of a new car, without even realizing that he is being watched by a little girl. At that moment, Luke comes across a truck with its headlights on, and after turning off the lights, he begins to investigate the interior of the vehicle. Thanks to this, the young man manages to find several objects that are capable of generating light, as well as a revolver that was hidden inside some rags. While spying on the young man, the little girl notices that shadows are beginning to fill the structures of the surrounding buildings, and decides to run away so that she won't be caught by the creatures. At the same time, Luke hears a song playing somewhere in the block, and as he runs to the location, he reaches 7th Street, where he finds a functional bar with energy. Taking advantage of his new discovery, the survivor decides to look for as many batteries as he can, as well as consuming some of the most expensive drinks in the establishment. During his rest, Luke realizes that the place has an extra door, with a flight of stairs leading down. When he arrives in the basement, he finds various supplies and survival tools, as well as a large generator that keeps the bar powered. However, before he could continue his investigation, Luke was surprised by James, who appeared pointing a shotgun at the intruder. After making the survivor drop his gun, the young man orders him to go upstairs, and when they reach the bar, Luke asks them to have a drink while they talk. As there was no reply, the young man decided to take it himself, and James ended up firing in the direction of the intruder, but the projectiles only hit the bottles. Annoyed, Luke orders the boy to put an end to this once and for all, but noticing that the young man is afraid to be alone, he decides to sit down so that they can talk better. Luke says he's happy to find another survivor in such an empty and lonely world, and says they can start working together to face the threats of the apocalypse. A few minutes later, James reveals that his mother was one of the bar staff and had left a few minutes ago to check on a light coming from the church. Upon hearing this, Luke hands one of his flashlights to the young man, saying that they must leave immediately. James then replies that he won't be going anywhere, as he still has to wait until his mother returns with the other survivors she rescued. Not wanting to waste time, the young man explains that the world is getting worse and worse, and even though it's already 11 o'clock in the morning, the city is filled with darkness. The survivor reveals that in the last 3 days he's been traveling, he's noticed that the sun is rising later and setting earlier, so the planet won't have any more light sources for some time. Despite this, James says that his mother will be returning to the bar in a few hours, and noticing that the boy doesn't want to accompany him, the young man decides to leave. In order to protect himself, Luke exchanges one of his flashlights for the shotgun, but before he can leave the establishment, he is surprised by Rosemary, who comes looking for her son Manny. Realizing that the woman is out of her mind, the young man tries to calm her down, but when he sees the survivor approaching, she grabs the revolver from the table and points it in his direction. Frightened, Luke begins to threaten the woman with his shotgun, causing her to fire in the direction of the pair, but the projectile only hits a few glasses. Soon afterwards, Rosemary falls to the ground in tears, begging for someone to help her find her son. Nearby, Paul wakes up after an accident in the middle of the destroyed streets, and tries to get to one of the bus stops to protect himself from the darkness. With the situation calmer, James asks if Rosemary worked at the city hospital, and the woman recalls that during one of her breaks at work, the power went out, and all she heard were people's cries of despair. At dawn, Rosemary ran to her mother's house, who was looking after Manny during her shifts, and was completely devastated to notice that they had both been consumed by the shadows. Realizing that she hadn't answered James's questions, the woman revealed that she worked in the physiotherapy ward, and as her husband often visited that bar, she decided to check to see if they were there. Trying to deflect the subject, Rosemary opens her backpack and reveals that she has several light sources, as well as having collected some neon tubes, which last for a long time. Just then, the trio begin to hear noises in the distance, and realize that a survivor appears to be injured in the next street. As he doesn't want anyone to take any risks, Luke decides to run towards the man, ordering the others to lock the bar door and only open it when he returns. Quickly, the young man sets off towards Paul, who is lying on the bench at the bus stop, but just as they are about to leave, the flashlight stops working. In order to get them out of there as quickly as possible, Luke sets off one of his flares, allowing them to run through the streets to safety, and halfway there the pair end up falling to the ground. Before they could be captured by the shadows, the young man took Paul in his arms, allowing them to enter the bar at the last second. A few minutes later, the survivors help the man recover from his injuries, and together they try to understand what could have triggered that apocalypse from the shadows. Believing that they may be being punished by God for their sins, Rosemary claims that there is a reason why they are there, making Luke increasingly angry. At that moment, the bar's power begins to fail, and noticing that the shadowy silhouettes have invaded the place, Paul shouts for the young man to reduce the generator's load immediately. Thanks to this, they manage to get the energy flowing again, and after realizing that the energy won't last long, they try to come up with a plan to get more light sources. Angry at what they are going through, Paul hits the generator with his leg, causing the lighting to fail again. Suddenly, the man begins to feel unwell and is taken to the pool table by his companions. While Rosemary tries to look after the survivor, Luke goes to the balcony, where he begins to have memories of when he went to the building where he worked. During his investigations, the journalist found the last recording made by the presenters, where he was able to watch the moment when the attack took place. Shortly afterwards, Luke heard a voice at the end of the corridor, and when he reached the living room, he came across a television still on, which was broadcasting the testimony of a researcher. The man explained that he was able to hear his younger brother, who perished many years ago, talking to him, so he urges the survivors to be careful, as the creatures are able to disguise their voices. At that moment, the power in the room stopped working, and to avoid being caught by the silhouettes, Luke ran to one of the windows, managing to save himself at the last second. Back in the present, the young man says that they need to leave immediately, and tells them that they are only safe because of the lights in the bar. The problem is that the place is not safe, but a trap, because when the power goes out, everyone will be wiped out in an instant. Upon hearing this, Rosemary says that she won't give up until she finds her son, and realizing that the woman is right, Luke decides to continue with them. The young man then explains that he had found a battery a few streets away, and if they managed to use the generator to charge it, they could have a functional vehicle to escape from there. So the group begins preparations to start the escape plan, and after handing James one of their flashlights, Luke asks him to flee as quickly as possible in case the lights go out again. Confused, the boy says that Paul can't be alone, but the young man just orders him to do as he's told and decides to hand over his key ring, saying that it might bring him a bit of luck. On the other side of the bar, Paul talks to Rosemary and asks her opinion of his appearance, since he's never had a girlfriend. Realizing that the cinema employee seems to be in love with her, the doctor is happy, and before leaving, she decides to kiss the man, who asks her to stay safe while she's outside. Soon after, Rosemary hands James one of her neon tubes, and together the survivors set off in search of the abandoned truck. Without wasting any time, Luke asks the woman to help him, and the pair start pushing the vehicle towards the bar. Meanwhile, James tries to ease Paul's fever, as he begins to lose consciousness due to his injuries. After being woken up once again, the man asks the young man to turn on the music box, but as soon as he hears the sound, the boy goes into a hallucination and is woken up by Paul, who shouts for help. So that he can help him, the young man decides to go to the bathroom to get some water, and at the same time, the power in the establishment starts to fail, causing a blackout. Due to the injury to his ankle while rescuing Paul, Luke ends up feeling severe pain and says he needs to stop for a few seconds until he has the energy to push the vehicle again. During the break, the pair realize that their flashlights have run out of battery, and they don't understand, since they had changed all of them just a few minutes ago. At that moment, Rosemary sees a girl watching them, and believing that she may be in danger, the woman shouts for her to come to them. However, when she sees the gigantic darkness that is approaching, the little girl takes off running, and no matter how hard he tries to chase her, Luke ends up falling to the ground. Quickly, the young man shouts for the woman to turn on the headlights, saving him from being wiped out at the last second. After rescuing her friend, Rosemary takes Luke back to the vehicle so that they can recover. Despite the massive blackout, Paul was not attacked by the shadows, and noticing that none of the silhouettes seemed to be wandering around, he decided to look for James. Realizing that the young man may have been eliminated, the man cries out for him in desperation, and during his search, he reaches the basement, where he comes across a door that opens by itself. Soon after, Paul hears James's voice calling him and decides to enter the tunnel in search of his friend. Among the streets of the neighborhood, the pair of survivors notice that the silhouettes are getting closer and closer, and they try to improvise a torch with the pieces of the vehicles. However, Rosemary realizes that she has forgotten her lighter at the bar, and so that they don't get caught, she helps Luke up and heads towards one of the buildings. When he realizes that one of the doors is locked, the young man uses his shotgun to destroy the lock, allowing them to enter the room. Thanks to this, Rosemary finds a box of matches, and after lighting the torch, they manage to scare away the silhouettes. Luke then asks how the woman knew about the location of the matches, since she didn't work there, and she replies that she used to smoke often, and only stopped when she found out she was pregnant. At the same time, Paul keeps hearing James calling him over and over again, but when he reaches the end of the tunnel, he discovers that it's a false door. Outraged, the man hits the wall repeatedly, and before he can escape, he is cornered by one of the silhouettes, which manages to turn off all the lights and capture its target. Soon afterwards, the energy in the bar began to flow again, and when James returned to the table, he saw Paul's clothes lying on the snooker table. In the building, Rosemary remembers that the place has stocks of disinfectants, and asks Luke to wait there while she goes off to look. During her search, the woman begins to hear a baby crying, and mesmerized by the noise, she drops her light stick and walks outside. As she does so, Rosemary comes across a baby carriage standing in the middle of the street, but as soon as she gets closer, she realizes that it is nothing more than a trap. Luke then realizes that his friend is taking too long, and rushes over to check what's going on, allowing him to witness the moment when the woman is eliminated by the shadows. He also discovers that the victims also turn into the silhouettes that roam the city, and so that he won't be next, he pushes the truck towards the bar as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, James realizes that the bar's power is about to go out, so he runs down to the basement to protect himself from the monsters. At that moment, the young man begins to hear his mother's voices, but before he can be captured, Luke appears and says it's time for them to go. Devastated at having lost two of his companions, the boy despairs and is calmed down by the young man, who asks him to stay in the car while he starts the generator. Without wasting any time, Luke rushes down to the basement, and after flicking the ignition a few times, they manage to start the vehicle, allowing the pair to escape from 7th Street safely. Minutes later, the young man concludes that he needs to close the hood so that he can drive, and asks James to keep his foot on the accelerator so that the truck doesn't turn off. However, as soon as Luke does this, the young man realizes that they are facing the church that his mother had mentioned, and is in a state of desperation to find it. Thanks to this, the boy rushes over and abandons Luke, causing the young man to get angry and decide to leave on his own. Before he could leave the city, Luke came across a strange word written on one of the bridges, and remembered that it was the same acronym that Paul had seen in his book of short stories and science fiction. Inside the church, James walks towards the altar and starts calling for his mother. At that moment, one of the silhouettes tries to approach the boy from behind, but before he can be eliminated, he ends up being saved by Luke, who comes along and destroys the entrance to the church with his vehicle. Despite this, James claims to have just heard his mother's voice and runs towards the sails, being chased by the survivor. However, before he could reach the young man, Luke noticed that the headlights had turned off, causing him to be eliminated in the same instant, without even being able to react. Frightened, James declares that he doesn't want to be erased, and because of all the panic he's feeling, he ends up falling unconscious. Hours later, the city is finally illuminated by daylight, and James is surprised by the mysterious girl, who has survived thanks to the lights in her shoes. The little girl reveals that her name is Brianna, and after introducing themselves, they both go outside, where they come across the sheriff's horse, which has some neon ribbons on its legs. Now that they are safe, the pair ride through the city in search of shelter, and after a few minutes, night begins to appear, with all the silhouettes preparing to feed on new victims in the darkness. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.